3 hours after we buried my brother. My husband put divorce papers on the kitchen counter and told me I would be fine. Derek still had his black tie loosened around his collar, the same one he wore standing beside me at Marcus's grave that morning. And he set the envelope down with the kind of calm that only belongs to someone who rehearsed this moment many times before arriving home. I stared at the papers without touching them. The kitchen smelled like the casseroles neighbors had dropped off, like cold coffee and someone else's sympathy. And Derek stood on the other side of the counter looking at me, the way you look at a problem you've already solved. "You'll be fine, Reagan," he said quietly. "You've always figured things out on your own." I picked up the pen and signed my name. Not because I had accepted anything, not because I understood what was happening, but because something in my body went very still, and that stillness felt like information. Derek looked surprised for exactly 1 second, then collected the envelope, went upstairs, and came back down with a bag already packed, which told me everything the papers hadn't. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the front door close behind him, and the sound of it was quieter than I expected. After his car disappeared from the driveway, I sat at the kitchen table without turning on the lights. The house made the sounds houses make when they're empty, small creaks and the hum of the refrigerator, and I sat inside all of it trying to locate some feeling I recognized. Grief for Marcus was already there, enormous and shapeless, but underneath it, something colder had started forming. The kind of cold that comes not from loss but from finally seeing clearly. I stayed in that chair for a long time, not crying, not moving, just watching the dark settle into the corners of the room. I thought about the envelope Derek placed on the counter and the notary stamp on the corner of the first page. I thought about the date printed beside that stamp, which was 4 days before Marcus died. Derek had not decided to leave me because his grief overwhelmed him or because the day broke him open in some unexpected way. He had already decided before my brother was gone, and he had simply been waiting for the right moment to set the paperwork down in front of me and walk away. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time after the house went dark, not ready to go back inside and not sure where else I would go. And somewhere in that stillness, my memory started doing the thing grief does when shock begins to wear off, which is reassemble everything you chose not to see. Derek had asked about Canopy Forward at almost every family dinner for the past year. Not the way a husband asks about work you care about, but the way someone asks when they are quietly calculating the value of something that does not belong to them. I had mistaken it for interest. I understood now it was inventory. Then I thought about Jessica Pratt. She had been in our lives so gradually that I never marked the moment she became a fixture, showing up at Marcus's office, joining family dinners under the cover of grant deadlines and shared projects, laughing at the right moments and listening with the focused attention of someone gathering information rather than enjoying company. I had told myself she was just someone Marcus trusted professionally. But sitting in that car, I remembered that Jessica was the only person at the burial that morning who never once reached for a tissue. And something about that detail, so small and so specific, settled into me like a stone dropping into still water. My phone was in my lap, and Marcus's voicemail notification was still sitting there unread, the way it had been since the night he left it. Because I had been telling myself I would listen when I was ready, and I was never ready. I pressed play. There was a pause before Marcus spoke, the kind of pause that belongs to someone choosing words carefully. And then his voice came through, tired but steady, the voice I had known my entire life. "Don't sign anything until you talk to Thomas Reed," he said. And then, after another beat, "And don't trust the people who show up crying the loudest." I listened to it 3 times without moving. Outside, a neighbor's porch light clicked on and then off again, and the street stayed quiet. And I sat there holding my phone with both hands, thinking about the fact that my brother had known, and he had still found a way to reach me before I had to face any of it alone. I went to Canopy Forward for the first time after the burial on a morning when the sky over Portland was low and gray and the parking lot was half empty in a way that felt wrong. Because Marcus's lot was never half empty. The organization occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in the Central East Side. And walking through that door, knowing he would not be at his desk, was the kind of thing your body resists before your mind has finished processing it. I made it as far as the front hallway before Priya Wade appeared. Marcus's field coordinator, a small woman with dark eyes who had worked beside my brother for 4 years and who looked at me now with an expression that was equal parts grief and barely contained fury. She pulled me into the narrow corridor beside the supply room and kept her voice low, speaking quickly the way people speak when they have been holding information too long and finally have someone safe to give it to. Jessica had been in the building twice during the week Marcus was in the hospital. She told me not to offer help, not to check on staff, but to meet privately with board members. And both times she arrived with printed proposals already prepared. Derek had been present for one of those meetings, introduced to the board as a financial advisor, which was a title nobody had given him and nobody had questioned out loud. Priya's jaw tightened as she said it, the same way mine did when I heard it. "How long have they been meeting?" I asked. And Priya told me the date without hesitating. The way someone tells you a date they have been repeating to themselves for days. It was the day before Marcus was admitted for the last time. I walked past her and into Marcus's office and sat down in his chair without asking anyone's permission. His desk was exactly as he left it. Field reports stacked by region, a coffee mug still sitting beside his monitor, and his computer screen still open to an email thread with Thomas Reed's name at the top. I did not read it yet. I just sat there with my hands flat on his desk and understood for the first time that my brother had not simply left me a voicemail. He had left me a map. Thomas Reed's office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Pearl District. Quiet and precise in the way that serious legal offices always are. The kind of place where people come when something has already gone wrong and they need someone calm enough to tell them exactly how wrong. He greeted me at the door, silver-haired and unhurried, and he did not offer condolences before getting to business, which I appreciated more than I expected to. He simply gestured toward the chair across from his desk, opened his laptop without explanation, and turned the screen to face me. The room was so quiet I could hear the rain against the windows 14 floors below. Marcus appeared on the recording, sitting behind his own desk at Canopy Forward, wearing the navy sweater he kept on the back of his office chair, and the timestamp showed he had recorded it 4 days before he was admitted for the last time. He looked tired in the way people look when they have been carrying something heavy for too long, but his voice was even and his eyes were clear, and he spoke like a man who had thought carefully about every word before sitting down to say it. Jessica Pratt had approached him months earlier under the framing of a strategic partnership, he explained. But what she was actually doing, methodically and with Derek's knowledge, was working to restructure Canopy Forward's governance documents in a way that would remove Reagan as a named beneficiary and position Jessica as the organization's primary decision-maker upon Marcus's death. Derek's role was financial credibility, a familiar face who could vouch for the restructuring to board members who might otherwise push back. They had moved carefully, Marcus continued, but not carefully enough, because he had seen the amended proposal Jessica submitted to Carl Odom before she realized Marcus had already spoken to Thomas Reed. He had updated his estate documents before they finished what they started. Thomas Reed held the originals. Reagan was the sole controlling beneficiary of Canopy Forward. No conditions, no shared authority, no room for interpretation. When the recording ended, Thomas closed the laptop and let the silence hold for a moment before he spoke. He recorded this the same week he changed everything, he said, and offered nothing more. Because Thomas Reed was the kind of attorney who understood that some information does not need to be framed or softened or explained. I sat across from him and felt the full weight of what Marcus had done, how precisely he had moved, how quietly, how completely without panic, making sure that when the people who came for what he built finally arrived, they would find nothing waiting for them except the truth of what he had already decided. I did not cry. I simply nodded once and asked Thomas what we needed to do next. I did not contact Derek or Jessica during those 30 days. I did not confront them, did not warn them, did not give them any reason to slow down or reconsider anything they were doing. Because people moving that fast and that carelessly do not need to be stopped from the outside. They stop themselves. Eventually, if you are patient enough to let them. I spent those weeks reading every file Marcus had left behind, learning the organization from the inside out, and waiting for the moment when their confidence would outpace their judgment completely. Derek and Jessica stopped hiding almost immediately after the burial, which told me everything about how certain they were that they had already won. Photos appeared on Instagram from a weekend in Seattle, the two of them at a waterfront restaurant. Derek with his arm around her and both of them smiling, the way people smile when they believe no one left standing can touch them. I looked at those photos once and did not look again. Not because they hurt, but because they were no longer relevant to anything I was planning. Inside Canopy Forward, Jessica had begun signing her name on internal communications as though a board resolution already existed authorizing her to do so, which it did not. Priya forwarded me a copy of an email Jessica sent to one of the organization's largest grant partners, introducing herself as acting leadership and referencing future programmatic directions Marcus had never approved. That email was not ambition. That email was evidence. And the moment I read it, I knew we had everything Thomas Reed needed to move. Carl Odom called me one afternoon, his voice carrying the particular discomfort of a man who had realized too late that he had been managed rather than informed. And he said quietly that he thought the board had made some mistakes listening to the wrong people. I know. I told him. I'll be in touch soon. I kept working. I read grant structures and field reports and the original articles of incorporation Marcus had filed when he started Canopy Forward with almost nothing. I learned the organization the way you learn something you intend to keep, carefully and completely. And I did not rush a single day of it. Thomas Reed arrived at the Canopy Forward board meeting carrying a leather portfolio and the particular stillness of a man who has done this before and knows exactly how it ends. Jessica was already seated at the conference table when I walked in, her posture composed and her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled patience. And she looked at me the way she had looked at me for the past year, like I was a variable she had already accounted for and dismissed. Carl Odom sat at the head of the table with the 6 remaining board members arranged on either side. And the room had the specific tension of people who sensed something was about to shift, but did not yet know which direction. Thomas opened his portfolio and began reading from the amended estate documents without preamble. His voice even and methodical, laying out Marcus's updated directives with the kind of precision that leaves no room for interpretation or negotiation. He presented the video statement. He placed the email Jessica had sent to the grant partner on the table, the one where she introduced herself as acting leadership without any board authorization to do so, and he set beside it the Oregon DOJ preliminary findings regarding potential misuse of nonprofit governance position. Jessica's composure held through the estate documents and through the video, but when Thomas slid that printed email across the table toward Carl Odom, I watched her jaw tighten for exactly 1 second before she forced it still. That 1 second was the whole story. Carl read through the documents slowly, and when he finished, he looked around the table and called the vote without editorializing. 7 board members. 7 votes. And when it was done, Jessica Pratt was removed from every role connected to Canopy Forward. And every document she had signed during the past 30 days was rendered void under Oregon nonprofit law. Carl turned to me and asked if I would accept the position of executive director. And the room went quiet in the way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the answer, but needs to hear it spoken. I looked around the table once, taking in the faces of people who had almost been talked into something they could not come back from. And then I looked at Carl and said, "Give me a week to read every file Marcus left. Then I'll answer." Carl nodded, and Jessica stood, collected her bag, and walked out of that room without a single word, which was the most honest thing I had ever seen her do. The consequences arrived quietly and without drama, the way consequences usually do when the groundwork has been laid correctly. Derek's brokerage firm opened an internal review after 3 of his clients, all of them connected to Marcus through Canopy Forward's donor network, filed complaints about policy information that had been shared without their authorization in pursuit of new contracts. The Oregon Department of Insurance pulled his license within 2 months of the board meeting, and the professional network he had spent years building in Portland contracted almost overnight, because industries that run on trust do not forgive that particular violation easily or quickly. Jessica's situation resolved itself with the specific finality that Oregon nonprofit law provides when someone has misrepresented their authority in writing to a federal grant partner. The DOJ investigation did not result in criminal charges, but it placed her name on a federal exclusion list that barred her from working with any organization receiving government grants for a decade, which in practical terms meant her career as a grant writer was finished. She had signed that email to the grant partner herself, introduced herself as acting leadership in her own words, and that document sat in the record exactly as she had written it, permanent and unambiguous. Priya Wade was appointed operations lead by the board, a decision that required no debate because everyone in that room had watched her hold the organization together during the worst month it had ever faced. Carl Odom sent me a formal written acknowledgement of the board's errors during the transition period. Not a phone call, not a casual apology over coffee, but a signed letter that accepted specific institutional responsibility, which was the only kind of accountability I was willing to receive from anyone at that point. I accepted the executive director position after my week of reading every file Marcus had left, and I kept the organization's name exactly as he had given it, because Canopy Forward was his, and that was never going to change. We expanded the program into 3 additional counties that first year, adding restoration sites Marcus had identified, but never had the funding to reach. I launched the Marcus Sutton Fellowship for students pursuing urban environmental work, and when the first recipient called to say she had been selected, she cried so hard she could barely speak, and I sat at Marcus's desk in the office that was now mine and let her take all the time she needed. On a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, I drove out to one of the restoration sites in the hills east of Portland. A stand of young Oregon white oaks Marcus's team had planted 3 years earlier, and I walked among them alone in the gray quiet and noticed that the tallest ones had already reached my shoulder. I stood there for a long time without thinking about Derek or Jessica or the board meeting or the voicemail or any of it. And for the first time since the morning we buried my brother, the silence around me felt like something that belonged to me rather than something I was surviving. I put my hand against the bark of the nearest tree and said nothing out loud, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. Thank you for staying with me through this one. Parts of Reagan's story live closer to my own life than I usually say out loud, and sharing it with you means more than I know how to explain simply. If something here stayed with you, pass it to someone who needs it today.